sisters.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. Are you ready for questions?
I am.
You're ready, okay. So what we'll do is, Ken would like one question at a time. I'm going to circulate the microphone just because if the air conditioning comes on, it's hard to hear. So if you could keep your questions brief, because Ken has also committed to making his answers brief, so that we can get as many questions happening as possible.
And then I get to sell my...
And then after we'll be signing the booklet, I guess, and such. Yes. So we'll have about half an hour or so of questions. So let me plug this in, and then we can get started. Okay. So I'll go around and hand you the microphone for your question. So first person. Okay. Second. Okay.
I just want to refer to August 1914. Is it when Austro-Hungary attacked Serbia, or the start answer to World War II referred to?
August 1914, it was the start of World War I. Everybody was asleep in Europe, having parties and stuff like that. A member of the Austrian royal family was assassinated, and within weeks the slaughter had started, which resulted in 7 million military deaths and the complete transformation of Europe and the world. And it was all because of the colonial drive to get colonies. And in fact, Syria itself is the result of that war. The purpose of that war, part of Russian, French, and English national interest was to destroy the Ottoman Empire. And what they did was they divided up the Ottoman Empire, and they purposely drew lines on a map so as to divide up the Arab people so they wouldn't form one big nation state, and they wanted to control the resources of the Middle East. So I use that analogy to August 1914 because I think most Canadians, most people in the West do not realize what's going on, the machinations that are taking place right now, and how dangerous they are to the peace of the world.
No, it's doing it. Go ahead.
How well was the Sunni population represented in the election?
Pardon me?
The Sunni population of Syria, how well were they represented in the election?
Well, I don't think that they kept records on people's voters who were of one ethnicity or another. People would just show their ID cards, their Syrian ID cards, and they would get to vote. So there's no way to know how many Sunnis voted, how many Alawites voted, how many Ismailis voted, how many Druze voted, etc. But I can tell you that the Syrian army is mainly Sunni, and yet it is the main bulwark of the state. So people in Syria, until this war started, didn't think of themselves in one sect or one ethnicity. They considered themselves Syrians. And so I think that's one of the negative effects of the Western-sponsored war of aggression against Syria, is that they started to foment these sectarian divisions between people that were not there before.
Can I add that we're here Syrians, I'm Sunni, Christian, Sunni, Central.
Well,
There's nothing. So the population for Syria.
Do you want to use this, please?
Yeah, Mike.
So that people can. Somehow their mics are misbehaving. I don't know why, but.
So the majority of Syria is Sunni. 70% is Sunni. So think about if 70% against Assad, he will not be in power now. Think about it, just logic.
So Ken, I'd like to ask you a question. So if someone said to you, I'm not anti-Assad, I'm anti-intervention, what would you say?
I would say that's a classic position of the anti-war movement. You didn't have to be pro-Saddam Hussein to be opposed to the war in Iraq. You didn't have to be anti-Gaddafi to be opposed to the NATO attack on Libya. You didn't have to be anti-Milosevic to oppose the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia back in 1999. What the anti-war movement has always taken as its classical position is, we're not concerned about the government in that country. We're concerned about the government in our country. Why is it breaking international law? Why is it using our money and attacking foreign countries? Our government should respect international law, should not be participating in these atrocities, and should be bringing home all its troops and equipment. This is the classic position of the anti-war movement.
I want to ask you, if you asked to meet Bashar al-Assad, what's your suggestion for him to do some reforms for Syrian people, or to help to correct some of his policies there?
Well, I think that Bashar al-Assad is associated with reform in Syria. It may not be all the reforms that some people want. It may be reforms that some people don't want, such as some of the economic liberalization that took place. But clearly, since he has come into power, the Constitution has been rewritten. Multi-party elections are now held. So I would say that there has been quite a lot of movement in Syria of reform.
And I want your suggestion after you see everything there, or most of things there. What are your suggestions? What do you think? Your own opinion?
First intervention.
Nothing that he is already done. I'm asking that your suggestions. I need your point of view.
I think that first of all, Bashar al-Assad needs to and probably will stay the course of this war and protecting the territorial integrity and national sovereignty of Syria. That's the main thing. I think that probably he should continue to have a government that has strong social programs. I think that it's in pre-war Syria. I'm not sure how it is. I think it's still the same. You know, Medicare is basically free. Education was basically free. 95% of the people own their own houses outright, which is a lot better than Canada, especially here in Toronto, without mortgages, I mean. And I think what he has to do, he should, I hope, in my opinion, resist the neoliberal agenda of Western countries to privatize the medical system, the education system, the water, and so on. I think he needs to stay the course with the program that Syria has had for 50, 60 years as an independent country.
Hi, I wanted to talk a little bit about the deception that you were talking about. Now, I think the most egregious was probably the supposed chemical attacks that were reported to have been carried out by Assad and his army, which, you know, people like Seymour Hershey you spoke about and others have clarified that was actually the rebel groups that had used them. And, you know, we saw this in Libya coming up to the intervention there. There was a massive campaign to demonize, you know, Gaddafi and his government. Now, so the same thing with Syria. Now, I just was wondering, you know, what, obviously following how this is reported in the mainstream media and then having gone to Syria yourself, you know, what did you find that people within Syria and in the region, how did they, you know, respond to this sort of coverage? And in terms of your analysis of this new multipolar world, how do you think that new media outlets like RT, who you used, or you know,
how do I think what?
How do you think new media outlets from like countries like Russia, like RT, or you know, Telesur, from you know, in terms of international solidarity, how do you think there's potential there to counter deception?
Good question. How do the Syrians regard the stories that have been, the lies and deceptions that have been circulated in the West? Well, they were thrilled. Anywhere we went in Syria, they were thrilled to see us and thrilled that there were people in the West who understood the issues and we're in solidarity with them, despite all the bad press, the demonization, the delegitimization in the West. So I think the people of Syria knew about these lies and deceptions. That's the first part. The second part is, how do we get around these lies and deceptions? You mentioned RT, a very good source. Almost everybody has access to RT if you have cable, or if you have a computer. You should be watching it because they do very good reports. You can watch Telesur. You can watch, I'm on Press TV myself. You can watch Press TV and see me as a talking head. These are good sources, and there are many other good. Syria Solidarity Movement has a website. You can go to Counterpunch. You can go to globalresearch.ca. There are many sources nowadays for people to counter the mainstream media. And I'm going to invite you right now, and in fact, to help in that process. There are two ways you could do it right away. One is you could join, anybody in this room could join the next, the third international tour of Peace to Syria. It's going in September. They're very optimistic that they're going to be visiting liberated Aleppo. You can do some crowdfunding. We have someone in the room, Mark Taliano. Would you stand up, Mark? Mark is already signed up for the next tour. He started a crowdfunding page. Today he hit $995 on the way to $2,500, which is the cost of the tour. If you're not going, you should go, so consider it. It's safe because you're in government-held areas. It's like living in Toronto or Hamilton. I never saw a single shot fired. I never saw a bomb dropped in the week I was there. You can go, or if you're not going, you can help Mark. He writes for Global Research, and he writes for the American Herald Tribune, I think it is.
Yeah.
And he's very prolific. When he goes there, he'll be doing just what I did, writing about it and speaking about it. So please support Mark. That's another way.
Thank you.
And can people consign to SyriaSolidarityMovement.org, so you will receive all of the particular information.
Right.
SyriaSolidarityMovement.org.
Thank you very much, Ellie.
Thank you for a great presentation, Ken. I'm just wondering, if there have been numerous reports of, you've mentioned the U.S. and Great Britain and France, etc. One country you haven't mentioned, and I'm curious about, is what you heard about Israeli involvement vis-a-vis supporting ISIS and their interest in seeing Syria fall.
Thank you for asking that question, Henry. I forgot, I neglected to hit on some of those points in my presentation. Israel is part of the nefarious plot to overthrow the Syrian government. It has been from the start. There were plans promulgated in Israel many years before this for the carving up of the Arab states to make it that much more easy for Israel to continue its colonial project at the expense of the Arab people. What has Israel done specifically? Well, it's bombed Syria several times, killed some leading people, leading military figures who worked with Hezbollah and Iran, in other words, allies of the Syrian government who've been there. More importantly, Israel provides free medical care for foreign terrorist mercenaries. There is a hospital just inside Israel, across from the Golan Heights, and wounded Syrian terrorists, jihadi fighters, are transported across the border with the full cooperation of the Israeli government and in sight of the UN post that's been there for since 1967, I think, and it's been well documented. Not only that, Prime Minister Netanyahu has shown up in this hospital and had himself photographed giving words of greeting to these al-Nusra fighters, Al-Qaeda, these al-Nusra fighters who are getting free medical care inside Israel and then shipped back across the border to continue their They're creating havoc in Syria. So, and also Israel is involved, incidentally, in helping this Kurdish separatist state in northern Iraq. So, and Israeli arms are to be found in the hands of many of these terrorist organizations, and Israeli personnel have been arrested and captured in northern Iraq.
Yes.
So Israel is in there like a dirty shirt, and they have said very clearly that they would prefer ISIS to be in control of Syria than President Bashar al-Assad. So Israel is playing the same dirty role it has always played as the henchman of the U.S. imperialism in the Middle East.
I think they're the leaders, no?
Yeah, exactly.
They lead it.
Please correct me wherever I'm wrong. And I agree with you what you said at the outset about the European colonialism. The British took to India with less than 3,000 soldiers through divide and conquer. We've had the mess all over Africa because of divide and conquer, that European powers supported minorities, and the understanding was the minorities that better support their European masters, or they will be destroyed by the majority who have been subjugated. So in many ways, what I see in Iraq and Syria were examples of Assad Sr., Hussein, and others that were supported by the Western powers to limit the spread of Russian influence in the area after Nasser experiences, etc. So what you've had a government there that has been a collection of a small minority. In Hussein's case, less than 30% of the population that ruled the country, and in so doing got all the privileges. And in the same way, in Syria, you had a collection of 6, 7, 8 sectarian religious groups who knew they better hang on together and defend, or the majority Sunnis will then, they will pay the price. So in many ways, I noticed that all of the reforms that you talked about have been very recent. Are they a matter of simply hanging on to power, or is there a reality there of this is the way to sustain ourselves, the 15% of the minorities against the majority out there that will do us in?
Well, your question contained many aspects. I'm not sure I can answer them all. Yes, it's true that the colonial powers put minorities in power in newly independent states because these minorities rely on the imperial government in order to stay in power. That's the normal practice around in the British, French, German, Belgian, and so on, and colonial powers. You were trying to make, I think, a rather simplistic comparison between Iraq and Syria, which I don't want to go into because it's very complicated. But in the case of Syria, I don't think it's a question of the Sunnis would be wreaking vengeance on other minority groups. I think in Syria you had a genuinely pluralistic society where people live together in peace for many, many years. And so I think that is what the current Western aggression is set, so determined to destroy.
Yeah, we don't feel who is Sunni, who is Shia, especially we don't feel in Syria at least.
We need only one person speaking at a time. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Oh, the question about reform. Yes, there's the fact of a war, and war is a good reason and to act quickly. And so I think that there was a lot of pressure on the Syrian government, especially in 2011, around that time, to move and make some changes, which they did, because of the so-called Arab Spring. But Bashar al-Assad is not his father. He came in as a unwilling, more or less drafted into the position. He wasn't intending to be the president. It happened. And he came at a time, people had a lot of expectations for change in Syria. And I think he is generally interested in those changes. And he's made some changes already. May not be all the changes that everybody wants, but there have been, important changes made. And there's lots of room. If judging by the elections that I witnessed in Syria a couple of months ago, there are a lot of people in Syria interested in these changes, and they are the sovereign force in Syria. They are the people who have the ability to make those changes, and their voices are being heard. That's what I've got to say.
I'd like to ask about Turkey, which a year ago was making enemies everywhere, shooting down the Russian jets, buying oil from ISIS apparently, having a porous border for jihadists to cross into Syria. But a couple of months ago, I guess it was, they kind of made up with Israel. They recently made up with Russia, it seems, and it's reported in the last few days that they're even talking about withdrawing from their position of calling for Assad to get out of, or to leave power. What was your assessment from the people you spoke to in Syria about the role of Turkey these days, and how do you see it?
It's all about the Kurds.
To be frank, I didn't speak to anybody in Syria about the specific question of Turkey, but I can give you my view of it. Before 2011 and the start of this covert war, Turkey had a policy of having zero problems with its neighbors. And in the period since then, it has developed problems with every single one of its neighbors because Mr. Erdogan was acting as if he wanted to revive the Ottoman Empire with him as the Sultan. And he collaborated with the United States and the Western powers to turn Turkey into a staging ground for the war against Syria. Something like 300 transport trucks left Syria every day to resupply the ISIS mercenaries in al-Nusra. Hundreds of oil tankers left Syria every day to go back to Turkey, where Erdogan's brother-in-law was in charge of the operation and got all the funds. That was until the Russian Air Force fixed that problem. So he managed to alienate all his neighbors. He waged a war against Syria, and he now finds, and he picked he had more or less the situation vis-a-vis the Kurds in Turkey had been more or less resolved, and then he reopened it last year. He reopened the old wounds and started the troubles again. And now in July of 2016, he finds that all his plans have turned to dust. He's losing the war in Syria, and it's more than you had said about the latest was the email I got today was that Turkey is going to restore diplomatic relations with Syria. It was announced today. So I think Erdogan has seen the writing on the wall. He's decided that he's seen that the Americans as well are supporting Kurds against him. So he said to himself, I'm losing the war in Syria. My patron, the United States of America, is working with Kurds against me. Maybe it's time I changed course and went with the other guys. And I think that's what's happening. I think I'm hopeful that what it means is that Erdogan has seen that the jig is up and that he had better mend his fences while he still can before he himself is overturned by the people in Turkey or by a military coup. So I'm hopeful that this is one of the signposts that's marking the victory of the Syrian government and Syrian people and the restoration of the national sovereignty of Syria and its territorial integrity and peace to the region.
Got a question right here?
Actually, it's not a question. It's referring to the question when we say humanitarian surety.
Can't hear you.
When we say majority and minority, and he means minority by Alawi, they are in the power and control in Syria, which is totally wrong actually. As you mentioned, majority of the people who support Bashar al-Assad, they are Muslim Sunni. And actually, if we remember Mr. Walid Muallim, he's not Alawi. If we gonna talk about Farouk Shara too, there is many other people who's in power in Syria. They are not Muslim Alawi. They are just Muslim Sunni. And actually, until now, since the war started in Syria, until now, we've never seen any Syrian presenter who works in the government went in the TV and said Alawi, Shia, Muslim Sunni or anything. And even actually in the last Geneva, when they asked Mr. Bashar al-Jafari a question about Shia and Sunni, Mr. Bashar al-Jafari, he refused to answer this question in this way, and he said, we are Syrian. And Syrian government until now, Syrian government until now, they are the one who presenting all Syrian, regardless what their ethnicity is or religion is. They are just for all Syrian. And that's why exactly majority of Muslims Sunni, they are supporting them.
I appreciate your presentation, Ken. I believe the most striking of all during your presentation is the picture of the Toyota pickup trucks. Because, you know, it's not going to a car dealer shop, you ask for a Toyota pickup truck or 2 or 5 or 10 or 100, but hundreds of them. By the way, which car dealer in Jordan has that many of those Toyota pickup trucks, and where do they park them overnight, you know? And then crossing to Syria, where by a slingshot you could hit the driver. Never mind bobbing them or strafing them and getting rid of them. My question, though, is about the bigger picture, as you were alluding to, in the Middle East, in the whole of that part of the world, where we have seen Iranian Revolutionary Guards and other elements helping the Syrian people to fight back ISIS and their supporters, as well as Hezbollah fighters, not only in Syria but also in Iraq. My question is, how come, at least as a matter of revenge, they have not been able to wreak the havoc that they have brought about in Iraq, in Syria, we have seen it in Turkey and other countries, to be able to do such things in Iran, you know. And one little comment, sorry my language, this bullshit that they kept bombing us with regarding Sunnis and Shia, this is absolutely nonsense. That they tried to say, oh, this is a divide, oh, I bumped it off, they were Sunni against Shia, Shia against Sunni. This is all backed up by the US and all the rest of the media all around the world trying to divide the people. Because I remember as an Iranian, right after the revolution, if I may, I really have to mention that, right after the Iranian revolution, if one thing that Ayatollah Khomeini said after the Iranian revolution was, whoever talks about Sunni and Shia is not a Muslim at all. So these things have been coming about just to confuse us. So I would appreciate if you just could elaborate on that. How come they have not been able to do such bombings and such in Iran while Iran has been attacking them through there? Thank you.
Okay. Iran has been a victim of terrorism itself. There have been many terrorist groups like the MKO, or otherwise known as MEC, who were sponsored by the West and given refuge in Iraq by Saddam Hussein. These terrorist groups killed many parliamentarians, many ordinary people, and so the government of Iran is very hard on terrorists. They do not let them operate they do not let al-Nusra, ISIS, any of these terrorist groups operate in Iran. I'm not sure if that answers your question. And the Iranian government has been a very steadfast ally of the Syrian government in fighting against these terrorist organizations as operating inside of Syria. other than that, I don't really have anything to say.
Okay, so we have time for 3 more questions. If you could keep them brief, please. So 3 more questions. I'd like to have one of those 3. So 2 others. Gentlemen here, and one last one.
This lady has been wanting to ask a question for a long time.
Okay. Is it going to be different than usual?
Pardon?
Different than usual. Okay.
Be brief? Oh, shit.
And then there'll be an announcement. So my question to you actually is 2. The reference to that meeting with Bashar al-Assad that you referred to, where he was given an ultimatum and given all kinds of conditions. If you could just quote where that came from, I'd be really interested in following it up. The second question is here in Canada. I have such a difficult time trying to understand how the Syrian community is so divided. And it's like, so for instance, the anti-Assad, pro-Assad, like how these are really intelligent people. They come from a pluralistic society, incredibly, well-educated and economically developed. You could say one of the premier Arab Middle Eastern countries. And yet, such an incredible animosity and division as we could see it here in our midst. And I can't quite wrap my head around the intensity of that animosity among reasonable, educated people. So those are the 2.
Well, I'll try to answer at least one of those. Well, I could answer them probably both. The first one, where the information came from about the deal that the U.S. offered to the Syrian government after the death of Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar's father. I think it's been recorded in a couple of places. I think, if I remember correctly, I read it in Mahdi Nezamroya's book, a very good book called The Globalization of NATO. So that's where I think I read that. Maybe Ali Mala, my good comrade back there, has other sources where he knows that it was written. As for the expatriates who are against their former government, well, I've been involved in the anti-war movement for a very long time, going back to Vietnam. That's a long time. And in every war, I have seen that there's always a few people who are expatriates living here in Canada who support the imperial war of aggression against their former homeland. I remember, for example, there were Iraqis living in Hamilton who used to tell us, "Oh, we can't wait until Saddam Hussein is knocked over by George Bush and Blair." And they were so excited about this, they wouldn't join the anti-war movement in Hamilton. They couldn't wait for the fall of Saddam Hussein.